camera keeps moving.
I like that your camera follows you. That's wonderful.
Yeah, it's a funny. It's funny. If it happens too much, it makes people dizzy.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I'm sure.
Hi, welcome to the Talking SaaSy show. I'm really excited today. We're going to be talking with Sarah Lane-Hawn, who is the HubSpot Admin of the Year in this year. So, yay, confetti! Congratulations on that accolade.
I appreciate it.
And so we're going to be talking a little bit about attribution. What is it? Why is it working or not working? We've seen a year of controversy around attribution, I think.
For sure.
So I'm really excited to kind of dive into that with you today, Sarah. So welcome to the show.
Thanks. I appreciate it. I'm excited to be here.
Let's start with you. So you are known as the MOPS Fairy. That is the Marketing Operations Fairy. And we just talked about your accolade of being the Admin of the Year for HubSpot. How did you first get into marketing operations? What inspired your passion for simplifying the inanely complex?
Yeah, I think a lot of it's just innate to me. So when I first started in marketing, I was in a company, two companies actually back to back, where neither one of them really had good business operations. Like there wasn't anyone internally driving how they did marketing, sales, and CX kind of alignment. And so my natural curiosity and passion for like, hey, if we're doing all this work in marketing to bring people in to get to know this brand, I don't want them to just fall off over time. I want to make sure that then we are nurturing them and the relationship is important through the sales process. And then we are continuing to honor that relationship throughout their experience as a customer. And so I started following lead journeys and then finding where there were unnecessary friction points, where either we weren't handing off information effectively to each other throughout the process, or where there was just too much actual operational steps where you would lose the client kind of synergy and momentum because it wasn't comfortable. It wasn't a natural communication, right? And so when I did that process, I think was my first actual inroads into operations, but I didn't know it at the time. And then my years in marketing automation, and specifically email, were what introduced me then to more of the data and the tech side of, oh, I have clients who need complex Salesforce integrations. Let's unpack that. What do we need? Why do we need it? How is it going to work for the business? So a lot of it for me was just innate curiosity and like needing to make things work. And then about 5 years ago, I leaned into it intentionally and found out that marketing operations was a thing and a specialty. And so moved from being a general marketing manager into a marketing ops manager at that point, and then have kind of doubled down from there. So
I read in your biography that you are a trained mathematician and artist. How do you think that background has played a role?
I do think that the unique combination of the creative and the analytical comes really well with a marketing operations. Like for any operations, you need the analytical side, right? But when you're trying to understand the marketing side of operations, like you really do need to have kind of that creative mindset, not just from marketing collateral creative perspective, but the creativity that it takes to understand buyer personas and what motivates people and how things are interacting in this really complex systems. And so I do think the combination of those two skill sets kind of uniquely has geared me towards doing this. But it also feeds both of those pieces for me, right? Like you need to be satisfied with what you do every day. And I love the problem solving. My analytical self is like, tell me it can't be done. And I want to go solve for that. But the creative side of me also wants to just explore and see what's possible and test out new theories. And so I do think that combo of skills works really well in the marketing ops world.
Yeah. I heard from an artist one time that I asked her, how do you know the work is done?
Mm.
And her reply was, I stopped working on it. Um, I thought it was fascinating, right? Because like when you're doing art, you really don't know, like, when is it actually done? Like one more little dot here, and then it's done. Like I don't think an artist feels complete ever.
Mm-mm.
Yet at the same time, when you're in business, you've got to ship.
Yeah.
Yeah. What has that experience been like for you?
I mean, art, a lot of times you talk about as an artist editing yourself, right? And so
Mhm.
not going too far because you'll actually overdo what you were working on. And so you're actually supposed to stop before you're done. Like that's an intentional like training thing to do in different types of art.
Yeah.
I do think that's true in the operations world as well, that like you can over architect anything. And so understanding the priority of what is my goal, what am I trying to accomplish? Once that goal is met, ship it, right? There's always more layers you can add, and that's what's so
Mm.
nice is if you build really intentionally, you build things so that you can always add layers, but you build that complexity in a way that you don't have to go back and undo stuff that you've previously built. So that drives a lot of how I think about data architecture is in the future when I want something different and I want to add to this and I want to make it more complex, will it still facilitate that? Will it scale?
Mm.
And that's something that I think a lot of people miss, is that we build for the moment and we try to build as complex as we can think for the moment, but we don't necessarily think of how this is going to change, how the business model is going to adapt over time as the company matures. And so you don't need to build for that future business. You can build for today, but build for today in a way that you can layer on for the future.
I imagine there were moments where you looked back and you were really glad you built something in a way that allows you the flexibility now
Yeah.
let's say now in the future, like, oh, thank you, past self, for giving me some flexibility in a room here.
Yep.
Can you think of any specific examples of where you were like, oh, I'm so glad I did
So
it
glad I
this
did that.
Yeah.
I actually had that happen just last week. I had a client come back, and originally they had only been doing like one event at a time, right? And so we had built this entire custom process with custom objects in HubSpot to monitor everything, and then that fed into their attribution model. And they come back to me and they go, hey, how we do events has changed. And so we're now actually having overlapping different types of events happening on the same day. And I'm like, oh, I don't know with how I built this months ago if this is going to break things. It's breaking reporting, but did it break the actual way in which I built kind of the underlying
Mhm.
architecture for it? And so I had to go back and like dig through how everything was structured.
Yeah.
And within 15 minutes was able to come back and say, okay, we're good. We just needed an extra filter on your reports, but all of your attribution, all of your logging, all of your SOPs for how to update things, that all still works. I just needed to add one more layer on top.
Mm.
So that was definitely one of those like, thank you, past self, for for building this in a way that even though it wasn't what we needed at the time,
Yeah.
pivot when the time came. And so that was a really nice like surprise one for me. And then there's been other times when I'll
Yeah.
build something intentionally so that a year later we can come back and like add layers on top of it.
That's so interesting. Can you think of a moment like where your past self said in this particular instance, I better do it this way and not that way because in the future we might have two simultaneous events going on.
Yeah, I mean, we thought through it. Like I remember, and this was over 6 months ago that we built this. And I remember us thinking through it and us coming up with the very clear deciding factor that we were only doing one event at a time. And so that's how reporting was going to be built. Um, but what I couldn't remember last week was, like, did I build it that way for everything else? Like, did I have to? Was there a point where it was one path or the other and I had to choose it? Or did I come up with something else? And my past self had come up with another solution, a third track that was able to pivot. So yeah, but usually when I'm going through a build process, those are the types of kind of consulting questions I'm asking people is like, as we're building for today,
Mhm.
can I build it in a way that even if they're not planning to pivot, if they do, it can change easily. And so that's always the goal is that whatever is being built is as flexible as possible, so that it can serve the need for the day, but the data is in a format that it can still be accessed and kind of manipulated in the future if it needs to be.
What what specific advice might you have for a RevOps or MOps person? Maybe they're diagramming a process right now, and it's all so tight, it interlocks like a puzzle piece, and they're excited. And you might come along and say, you should have some gaps. Like what kind of advice might you give specifically to someone working on this right now?
So I love a good flow chart, but I think they're really deceptive. I
Mm.
think they make us feel way too comfortable with how it goes, and it makes it feel like everything's very isolated and very clean and linear when that's not at all how our data architecture goes. It's three-dimensional. Like it's not just a tangled web, it also comes out and things are doing all sorts of weird hyperbolic space geometry on us. And so it's important when you have a flow chart and you've come up with a program to start poking holes in it from other areas of your database that still connect, right? If you're working on like a contact based workflow, whatever that may be, and it's living fully on the contact level, that's wonderful. But contacts interact with companies. Where is company data going to come in and try to disrupt this? Where is deal data going to come in and disrupt this? What if you get a new contact, but it's in the same company? Like, is that going to change things, right? So, trying to poke holes at it from the sides versus like necessarily getting into the weeds of the workflow itself and critique, like, zoom out and look at the other things that are tangential that are actually going to potentially have unknown impacts.
I really like that. We did a pre-mortem yesterday with our internal team here at Interact, and um, it was great. Have you heard of a pre-mortem? With those
I
of us,
haven't heard of it, but it makes sense.
the idea is that you imagine you've done the thing and it failed, and
Mhm.
it's like it's done, and it was a catastrophic dumpster fire. Um, why did that happen, right? And like you put on the creative hat, you say, why did it happen? And then you start sort of thinking about all the reasons why your project could fail.
Yeah.
And then what you come out with is sort of this list of risk mitigation steps that you can start prioritizing.
Yep.
And it sounds like that's what this is. Like, okay, you've got a great flow chart and it looks really great, and all the executives think you're smart. But what happens when that salesperson uploads a CSV that they got done on Fiverr and it breaks everything?
Yeah, how can it be broken is always the
Right.
question, and it's the good question, like, you want to find things, because it gives you not only an opportunity just to fix what you're building, but to level up everything. I mean, a lot of times the project that you're working on, you end up finding ways to up level things that you didn't think were related, but just because you asked those questions, right? And then there's other things that you're gonna come up with that are worst case scenarios that then you realize is like less than a 5% chance of ever
Yeah.
actually happening, in which case you write it down and you manually communicate to the stakeholders, hey, if we ever see this, it's because this really weird thing happened. Let me know. Because, like, we have to give ourselves room to not have perfection in a model because, again, we'll end up over architecting. And I'd much rather have processes be human centric so that humans then know, hey, this was an error. Can we fix it and can we prevent it in the future? Versus them never raising their hand because they think it's all perfect, which means the errors are going unnoticed somewhere in the database. I'd
Mm,
much rather them be visible so that we can actually
mm,
know and fix to what is legitimately happening in our world.
mm. Sounds like you're advocating for a kind of operational transparency,
Oh yeah.
like the Domino's pizza effect, as it were. Cool. Let's go back to attribution. Rand Fishkin got on LinkedIn about 4 months ago, and he basically said, attribution is dead. Attribution is dead. You've got, Safari blocking cookies and TOS changes and all kinds of, device format, whatever. And his argument was just stop trying to justify your marketing spend with single touch linear attribution models. And so I think that's where you're kind of coming in and saying, all right, let's talk about multi-touch. Let's talk about it from a campaign perspective, that at an account level, an account might have 20 different touches with 5 people across multiple different channels. What does that mean to my ROI? So what do you think the biggest misconceptions are about attribution? And how do you help teams shift that mindset to really see it work?
Yeah, I think the first misconception is that it's going to be perfect, that it's even feasible to actually capture every touch point and then assign it an actual revenue value. And it's not. And that's why people are trying to say, hey, let's stop getting so far into the weeds of trying to justify, and let's go back to doing good marketing. And I think there's a point to that where we've seen people over focus on more measurable channels like paid media, because you can get the reports. And so it's just much easier to justify dollars in, dollars out. But it's not the most effective. You need to have all of the different brand marketing as well, in order to have a truly effective, scalable brand. So I get the point, and it's well meant, but if we can all come to the understanding of our goal of attribution is to learn and use numbers to assign value to different channels so that we can articulate the narrative of what is working and what is not and where investment needs to be made. That's what everybody wants out of it. That is the goal. Nobody's looking at you and saying, hey, did all 100 minimal touch points get logged? I want to know exactly what these numbers add up to. No, they want to know, hey, is having someone write a blog worth it? Or can we cut that cost and put it somewhere else? Those are the questions you're answering. And so I think if we can get away from that perfection concept, then we can get to something useful that also doesn't take up everybody's time so that marketers can keep marketing.
Yeah, that makes sense. What's the point of it? Is it to have a scientifically accurate graph for the Smithsonian? Or is it to get enough information to make a decision, right? It sounds like that's what the priority here is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Now, you've worked extensively with B2B SaaS startups. And I think there's a kind of complexity to that buyer's journey in this space, right? That you've got multiple buyers, you have a subscription model business. There's B2B SaaS is a unique beast. It's not like anything else out there. So are there any strategies or frameworks that you would recommend for mapping and tracking touch points more effectively?
Yeah, the actual tracking is the interesting question to me because I don't think there's great ways to do that. You just kind of have to unpack all of the primary channels that you're using and figure out what's feasible. And there's just going to be ones where you're like, those scenarios I will never see. I'll never capture those particular moments, but can I capture something on one side of it or the other? And that'll be enough to, again, inform me. As far as the model itself, I think multi-touch is a requirement. There just isn't a case anymore where first or last touch tells you anything. For one, because there's going to be a huge chunk of just missed touch points, right? Miscategorized, unable to track, that by limiting yourself to only one touch point, you're already saying, I want to kind of not have as much accuracy. Whereas at least if you capture multi-touch across their lifetime of a company, your likelihood of catching those different types of interactions is just going to be higher. So you're going to have more data. So you're increasing that accuracy at that point, right? I do think being able to capture it from an ABM motion is really important. A lot of times people will do a model just based off of who the contacts are associated with the deal itself. And one, congrats if your sales team is putting all of the appropriate contacts on deals, but I know very few companies where they would say, oh yes, every deal has all the contacts, right? So there's already going to be a miss there just from a data processing perspective.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, like you said, like there's multiple buyers and multiple influencers in any given sales cycle, ones that you may never interact with, but still on the back end, they're doing research, they're doing comparisons, they're looking at things. And so for me, it's really important that that rolls up. And if we're going to do attribution, I want to know everybody at that company who interacted with my brand.
One thing I know about a good salesperson is that they're rule breakers. A good salesperson, right? They're hard to manage. They're scrappy, and they do not like entering data in their CRM.
Yeah.
But you want them on your team, right? Because they're closing deals. So we as marketers, especially in ops, have this problem of how do we get the data? How do we build models that kind of account for the unreliability of the input?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I like what you're saying there. And maybe just for folks who are watching this, could you maybe paint the picture about what first last attribution is in contrast to multi-touch?
Sure. So when I'm talking about it, what I'm specifically referencing is grabbing the first known interaction of a contact. So where ideally that contact was sourced from. Did they get to know you at an event, trade show? Was it a purchase list, right? How do they make it into your system? And sometimes that'll be used by a company to do full credit of any deals that come through. Well, we got to know them through an event, so therefore that deal is credited to that event. Or we bought that list, so that deal is credited to the fact that we did a list purchase. The last touch, similarly, is what happened right before an opportunity was opened. How did we get the meeting is usually kind of the theme. And so did we get that by SDRs doing outbounding and like pulling that meeting in? Or did they come through a landing page from a certain campaign? And that was kind of that last trigger step. And so that also is used by some people to credit. And that more often I see as people assigning credit between sales and marketing sourced. If they're using just last touch, is they want to know, was this opportunity generated because we were doing outbound, or was this opportunity generated because it came inbound? Terrible practice in my opinion, but I think those are kind of the two main ways in which those are used.
What could go wrong?
For one, especially in B2B, nothing's a linear sales process. And so people aren't just coming in because they talked to sales, and they aren't just coming in because there was a marketing campaign. It is a combination of all things brand and how well your sales team is engaging people along the actual early journey. And so it can easily create a divide between marketing and sales instead of unifying those efforts and saying, this is something that we need brand, we need sales enablement material, we need marketing campaigns, we need people on the phones, we need sales sequences going out, we need all of this in order to generate it. So I think it creates an actual internal barrier to success. And then it also, from a just data perspective, we'll talk about last touch, you're going to just only ever get in that field how you book meetings. So it's like a self-answering problem, right? Where you're going, oh, well, what happened to cause the meeting to get booked? And your last touch field is going to be like, oh, they clicked the Calendly link in the BDR email. Oh, that must be outbound. Well, no, actually, they had gotten on a webinar and then they went back and found the sales email that they had so that they could book in, right?
Yeah.
Or, oh, they came through the web form to book a meeting. So it must have been direct organic traffic, driving this. No, they had gotten a LinkedIn message from my sales team member and then Googled the website to get on to the page so that they could book a meeting. Like it misses the fact that there's this whole world of interaction happening and it's not just that one point.
Do you think if someone could crack first party off page signals, they'd be a billionaire?
For sure, because I think it would be a really helpful data point to understand how did someone really come to know our brand? Where was the introduction actually made in the world? Because there's no method to know that right now. Like self-reported attribution is honestly in a lot of ways as close as you can get when people say, I found you through this referral. I found you through this website. But that's almost always diluted because it's from our own perception of how we found out about a brand, whereas the power of marketing is that it's subversive. And so you may have actually been introduced to that brand 6 months ago, but you didn't know it until it came back around in a specific way. And that's what you remember. So the subversive part of marketing, I think, would benefit a lot from having that data point and having that the actual foundational information to say, see, like all of those things we're doing to create brand awareness and just be out in the world and be memorable, those are working.
I'm reminded of the old blockchain, the Matt Damon blockchain commercials. It wasn't blockchain, it was another crypto brand. But you go to the movies and you're watching a movie and then Matt Damon's like walking in space and he's like, the future is crypto. Blockchain.com. And like you go see a movie and you're getting exposed to blockchain.com and then you wind up on their website and sign up for a webinar and then maybe you get a free trial or something like that. And meanwhile, everybody at that company thinks, oh, our website's so great. Let's keep paying our SEO team. And it had nothing to do with their SEO team at all. It was the ad that they dropped $1 million on for for Regal Cinema. How would they ever know that? Boy, they would want to know that. Speaking of which, you talk a lot about turning attribution data into actionable insights. And I wonder if you could share with me and our watchers here an example of how you've helped a company to take raw data and turn it into measurable outcomes that actually impacted pipeline.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So part of attribution for me, one piece is answering the revenue attribution need for the C-suite to go raise money and report to the board. That is very high level, like literally taking all your revenue, sticking it in buckets, making sure it's understandable, right? So that there is confidence in the numbers. And I think that's key. But that purpose really just unlocks the ability for then the marketing leadership to display the narrative of what's been happening and what's going to pivot in the future. It doesn't necessarily drive decision, in my opinion. I don't think that view can drive decision, but it can help inform the narrative and help people tell the story. I do think that when you're doing channel by channel or campaign by campaign investigation, influenced revenue is actually very powerful and is much more useful for the day-to-day marketer because then you actually are able to look at multiple channels side by side and say, these dollars aren't real dollars, right? Like we didn't actually make this much off of doing this one thing. But they are great units to be able to compare one channel against the other.
Yeah.
And so we've used that. There was a company that was evaluating event marketing, and they had pivoted from big corporate events to doing hosted small like dinners,
Mhm.
and felt like it was working great. They had enough individual case studies to know that it was bringing in enough revenue that they really wanted to expand this program. But they wanted to figure out like how far they could stretch it and double down on it before it would stop having the return that was useful. Um, and so creating like good actual revenue attribution for them was really important in that. And so we both for them have influenced revenue to be able to analyze and compare each event to each other to say, oh man, when we do dinners in New York, great influence. When we do dinners in, certain areas of Texas, not as big of influence. So if we need to cut somewhere, we need to double down somewhere, we're probably going to stay in this
Mm.
metropolitan city, right? And so
Mhm.
we use it that way for those decisions, but then we did actual revenue as well, so that at a total level, we could see how much the events had truly impacted revenue for the year and what portion of the total revenue for the company we could say they get full credit for. And that was actually about half as much as they thought it had been. And
Mm.
so what we were able to do was say, hey, it's half as much as you thought. So they're
Mhm.
not quite as amazing, but it's still really valuable. And so now you can tweak where you're increasing your investment, that instead of going all in, we say we still want to grow it, but we want to grow it with more intentionality. We're not just going to double down and do twice as many events. We're going to do more in key cities with these key parameters so that we're being really smart with how we actually execute the program.
That's a great example. I love that where executives might say, "Oh, look at how great these small events are over the giant corporate conferences." But when you peel it back, there's nuance.
Mhm.
Some cities are better than next. The cities that aren't doing so well are dragging down your ROI.
Yep.
Don't just throw more money at it, because I think that's the easy answer. That's the lazy answer. Here,
Mhm.
have some more bucks. No, think about the nuance, the subtlety of that strategy, and so that's a great example of how looking at the right data led to a better decision outcome, probably and more money, more
Yep.
ROI.
Yeah, that's the hope.
Yeah. So HubSpot Admin of the Year, undoubtedly, undoubtedly, indubitably. You've probably seen the good, the bad, and the ugly in tech stack implementations.
Mhm.
So tell me, if you could share, and you don't have to name names, but what are the biggest mistakes you see companies make, that specifically that you've seen them make when trying to optimize their MOPS?
Mm. I mean, the biggest mistake is not, honestly, like
Mhm.
a lot of companies, marketing operations is given a back seat and they don't really invest into it ever. And they just ask their marketing team to become data like analysts and operations experts, which is not going to happen. So that's the biggest problem.
Yeah.
Within a database itself, there's so many ways to make a mess. Um, and I think one of the biggest problems is when people recognize it's there and then they just double down on it. And I find that a lot where people will come and say, "Oh, we know our database is such a mess. We know we have a bunch of contacts in there that aren't viable. We know that none of these things are accurate." Like they know that so much is inaccurate and bad, and yet they've never stopped to solve even one of the problems. They've just accumulated more and made a list of all of the problems that they have. Um, And so I think it's just so important that even if you pick it apart a little bit at a time, I mean, that's what we do as marketing operations people. Like, it's not like we go in with a bulldozer and clean out the whole thing and do a rebuild. Like, we're going to go into an existing database and fix one section at a time
Yeah.
and do repair and right. And so I think that's one of the biggest mistakes is just waiting until you're at like this critical mass before you do any work.
The
Um,
the ostrich effect, I think that's called.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
the other piece from the data itself,
Mhm.
is trying to build too much stuff custom when you don't have someone strategically leading. What is the data architecture gonna look like? How is it gonna scale? How do other things interact? If you don't have someone with that skill set, and yet you're like, well, everything about our business is unique, custom field, custom field, custom field,
Yeah.
and start just building everything. And then you also end up with a mess, but that's much harder to untangle um, because you first have to have somebody go analyze what'll this break when we fix it? How do we go and get
Mm.
historic information, or is it all just lost? And a lot of times you'll end up losing a lot of information, or they'll think they had historic information, um, but it actually wasn't being stored in a way that's usable. So it's not actually there. And so I give a big warning for like if you're constantly making custom properties, maybe
Mm.
pause and consult with somebody. They may all be needed, but they might not be. So it's always worth a pause.
You bring up a really good point. It reminds me of a situation we were in with a client who, um, I mean, they are unique, but they also made a lot of unique fields with regards to source. And
Mm,
um, at least in HubSpot, there's a lot of back end unseen automations around source
mhm,
algorithms that are really powerful. And so when you separate from the built-in source algorithm to custom fields, you lose all of that attribution. Um, and so we noticed they had their like 2 or 3 different source custom fields that were just created, and it took quite a bit of work to back them into the where they should have been, which is
yeah.
the built-in source attribution for all the built-in reporting and automations that were available. I wonder if you have similar examples of maybe a client you had who um, maybe shot themselves in the foot, similar to what this client did.
I'm trying to think of what the recent one was because there was somebody earlier this fall that we were cleaning up something that they had growing for I mean, years, like 4 or 5 years been filling out, and then when we went and analyzed it, like, none of the data was useful because half of it had been automatically filled in, others had been manually filled in, other
Mm,
like, and it was a custom field, but it had been used really inconsistently over the years, like, different people had come in and used because it was a multi-select field, but I can't remember what it
mm,
was being used for. I just remember getting in there and saying, "Okay, well, which of these field options are even, like, valid anymore? Like, what applies to the company?" And it was a handful out of the, like, 20 plus that were in there. And so
mhm.
then any of the ones that were in there that weren't the current up-to-date ones, we just had to lose. We're just like, "Well, they
Yeah.
don't mean anything anymore." So that data's just gone. Um, so I think
Mm.
pick lists are a good red flag, um,
Hmm.
or open text fields. Those are the 2 where, like, if you're constantly using an open text field or a pick list that you're modifying and having to add options to, um,
Mm.
you probably have some form of issue of long-term just data degradation, um, and need to go back and see, like, is any of the stuff that you put in there 2 years ago, like, even worth anything anymore? Um, I wish I could remember the actual, like, use case of what that field was that they were using it for, but, we just I remember ending up losing a lot of data,
Mm.
because it had changed. The purpose of that field had been used for so many different things over the years.
That's really interesting. Lot of good red flags or yellow flags for marketing teams to pay attention to.
Yeah.
If you're making a lot of custom fields without thinking about what might already exist, if a lot of your fields are open text and anyone could write anything. I think the third one you said was if you keep adding selections to a multi-select, maybe the purpose of that multi-select needs to be considered.
Yep.
A lot of really good, I think, symptoms to a larger problem of not having maybe would you say a central model for running their operations?
Yeah, or just an owner who's able to focus in on those things too. I mean, the way in which you do operations can change over time. It's going to mature, but if everybody's just in there doing the best that they can out of it, and there isn't anybody making this be, hey, this is our standardization of when we build a pick list versus an open text versus a drop down, like, somebody has to standardize that kind of strategy for the company. And I mean, that's true when using consultants too, right? Like if you use two different consultants over a couple of years, you'll find that their strategy and their standards are going to be a little bit different because we all think differently. And it doesn't mean one's wrong, but you need to have like a way for your business that you keep things. And so like a good consultant can come in, see how stuff was built, as long as it's not broken, be like, oh, I would have done that differently, but okay, this is how we're doing it. It works. Great. And you layer on top of that. Whereas, if you're just kind of all ad hoc doing your own thing, again, you create more noise.
So it sounds like you're advocating for you should have a MOPS person on your marketing team. Everybody should.
I mean, I think so. At this point, with as deep as we are into integrations and data being key, and integrating marketing and sales tactics so closely, like you have to have the operational architecture and ongoing strategy. And whether you can bring somebody on full time or you equip somebody in-house to kind of maintain, but you have somebody outside do the basic strategy and architecture for you, or you hire somebody fractionally. There's tons of options to be able to get really great support. But I think you need the support. And like there are a handful of people who can truly do rev ops, who can do both marketing and sales across the entire revenue funnel. But I'd argue it's a handful. I think most people are going to lean one direction or the other because it's so much information to know. And so to be able to be an expert at all of it is nearly impossible. So most people are going to either tell you, hey, I lean really heavily into marketing ops. Here's the areas of sales ops and revenue that I can do. Or, hey, I lean heavily into sales operations. Here's where I can kind of lean into marketing. But I think that's a nuance that people also need to be aware of.
Yeah. This is great. And I wanted to kind of share, I was listening to the SaaStr podcast, and I forget who the guest was, but he had done this pretty intense research into sales funnels in 2023 and 24. And they're huge. People's pipelines are enormous as compared to previous years. So we have plenty of pipeline, but close rates have not changed, right? Like there seems to be almost a zero correlation between these days, and I don't know why, it could be AI, that you have maybe doubled your pipeline, but you're not closing at a higher rate. In fact, you're not even closing more, even with more opportunities. And I wonder if you think marketing ops has a role to play in solving for that problem, or maybe there's some culpability too.
Yeah. It's an interesting problem. I can say from my experience, I find a lot of companies, especially in startup phases, who rely on opportunities and deals as their way to operationalize the sales path. And so how to know what their AEs need to focus in on, what the activities need to be, tasks, et cetera. And because they focus so heavily on the opportunity kind of area of a CRM, they tend to want things in there as soon as possible. So they're creating opportunities much earlier, which then inflates your pipeline. But those are not necessarily what we would have historically said are qualified leads who should have an opportunity that is actually active. So I do think marketing operations combined with RevOps has an opportunity because it's often a missed opportunity to look and say, hey, how are we actually qualifying leads? What do we mean when there's an opportunity on the board? And so how do we make sure that between someone being viable and there being an actual opportunity to sell them something, that we have a nurture path between those two, because that's where things get really murky. And I think that's where our conversion rates just either die or succeed, is between this is qualified as a person and a company, and do we actually have an active opportunity to sell them something? And if that portion of the funnel, which is in between marketing and sales, is optimized, everything else should filter through and have increased conversion. So that's actually the area that I focus on. That's where I'm most passionate about building, is qualification through to like actual opportunity vetting, and how between BDR and outbounding and inbound efforts, they kind of all amalgamate right there. And that's like your core spot to impact your funnel the most.
Fascinating. So it's almost like there's a nuance between MQL and SQL that we're just missing.
And in opportunity creation, like it's not an opportunity just because you'd like to sell to a company and they're in your target demographic. Like that means they're a target account. That's lovely. There is no opportunity actually. Their opportunity means they actively are looking for a solution, and
market.
you have the option to be one of the people to sell to them. Like that's an opportunity. And I think that nomenclature has gotten messed up over the last couple of years from what I've seen.
I would just want to repeat what you said. Just because you want to sell to them doesn't make them an opportunity.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. Put that on a t-shirt. Right. Because opportunity is, I mean, whatever model you use to qualify them is that they have the money, they have the need, and they're going to be buying in the next 3 months.
Some amount of time, yeah.
That's an opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah. And that may be a qualified op, right? Like that may be one step removed, but the creation of the op still shouldn't just be, it's a target, right? There should at least be some level of they are interested, they are communicating, there is actual discussion taking place to fully qualify those buying behaviors. But it can't just be they're the right target. We know who they are. They know who we are. Hurrah. Like we gotta get some qualification done of actual buying intent before we start considering things opportunities.
I could be wrong here, but it feels to me like this is a misconstruction of ABM theory. If you have a targeted account list, they're already qualified because you want to sell to them.
Right.
So even MQ SQL nomenclature doesn't make a whole lot of sense in the ABM world, because they're accounts you want to buy from you. It might not be now, it might be in 2 years from now. I don't know. I could be wrong there, but it seems like the MQSQ opportunity flow wasn't really created with ABM in mind when you actually have a targeted account.
I think the difference is that you're not just creating those milestones based on demographics and company elements, right? It's not just can they buy. It's the two-way street of, do they want to buy? Are they interested in us? And so that's where like behavioral scoring comes into place for MQL and SQL, is that like, yeah, by default, they're going to hit their demographic threshold because they're your target, but they will not by default hit the behavioral threshold. And so
Yeah.
that's why you need both in order to qualify somebody, both MQL and an SQL stage, is that their behavior has to demonstrate buying intent, sales readiness. Then you get into meetings, right? Then you get into the point where like you've already qualified, again, demographics. That doesn't qualify their timeline. That doesn't qualify, right? Like which competitors are you up against? How eager
Yes.
are they to
Same.
change? Like
Yep.
all of the other aspects that are actually going to determine if you win it or not. Because it's the same thing as people looking at like their total addressable market and then having the guts to think that that's their potential pipeline. Like total addressable market is never going to be your total addressable pipeline. Like, come on now, little hubris is not necessarily healthy. And so I think we just have to understand that like in business, we are selling to people and
Mhm.
like this is a two-way street. And so you have to build your operations to recognize the human element and that it needs to go both ways.
I love that. I think it aligns really well with this sort of like matrix of lead score, where the old model was sort of, it's very linear. If they fit, they're qualified. But I think the new way of looking at lead scoring is, of course, they fit because they're near target market. Like,
Yep.
but do they engage?
Mm-hmm.
How much?
And the complexity between those two, right? And I
Yeah.
talked about this. Danielle Urban and I have a show that we do at lunchtime each day on LinkedIn. And last week we actually were going through attribution, and I think it was in one of those conversations we talked about that. But or it may have been one of the other ones. I'm not sure. But anyway, we talked about lead scoring and how it's important to kind of set up your demographics and your behavior to have flexibility so that you can say like, hey, maybe I don't typically want to sell to managers because they're not the decision makers. But if my product is specifically geared towards CX and a CX manager comes through,
Mm-hmm.
they get extra points because they're the right
Mm.
group and they're going to be able to connect me to the decision maker immediately, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas if it's a VP of sales and I'm trying to sell to CX, like, yeah, you're a VP, but you're not going to be the person that's going to make the decision for this particular product. So you're not going to be as viable. And so it's understanding like if a VP of sales is super engaged with me, that still doesn't make them a better lead than a manager of CX who's a little less engaged with me, but I know is going to be able to speed up the sales
Mm.
process. So understanding those nuances of it's not just the person with the highest title who does the most,
Yes.
it's the right people with the
Yes.
right level of engagement for me to go, that's enough. That's
Yeah.
enough for me to reach out now. I think you're ready enough for a
Yep.
conversation.
And I would argue there's another dimension too, which is the right time.
Yeah. Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think that's why, for me anyway, like MQL and SQL, whatever you use as your routing for sales, the behavioral element of it, right? When somebody hits that threshold, that has to be the last step before you trigger an alert for somebody to reach out because it needs to be timely. And
Mhm.
so if you trigger it based on, okay, we found out something demographically about this company today. Ooh, they hit our score. Hold on.
Yes.
How'd you find out? Is it because we just did an enrichment? That's lovely. Hold,
Yeah.
please. Okay, now they came back and they visited my site. Now we call them. Now's the right time. The behavior score just went up.
The behavior
Now
should
we
trigger
call them.
the event, the touch.
Yep,
Yeah.
exactly.
We have come to that point in our show where I get to ask you some rapid fire questions. Are you
Okay.
ready?
Yes.
Okay. What is your favorite guilty pleasure?
Oh, always chocolate.
Mm, good
Yeah,
one.
it's not super guilty, but always chocolate. Yeah.
Very good one. I agree. How, And how do you like to consume your chocolate? Do you like to drink it, have it in a chocolate bar, have it in a cookie?
No, usually Trader Joe's or Whole Foods, like dark chocolate caramels.
Mm.
That's really the best. Something that's small and nibbly and yes, delightful.
All right. I am missing Trader Joe's right now. What are you reading right now, and would you recommend it?
Oh, I just finished the book Wings, which was a fiction novel about a teenager who found out she was a fairy. It was okay. It wasn't the most well-written or interesting novel, but the book kind of started over again in the middle, which was a little odd. But it
Mm.
was good. It was a good, cute, fast read.
Okay. If you weren't doing this job, what's the most unusual job you'd be doing right now?
I would love to be a Tinkergarten teacher. So those are like the alternative schools that meet in the woods and they just like introduce kids to all science and math and knowledge, but through kind of organic discovery and hands-on learning. And that would be a phenomenal, very different life path.
That sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah.
What's the weirdest or funniest habit that you have that might surprise people?
I sound like a Muppet often when I get angry, and it makes it really hard for people to take me seriously while I am angry, but, yeah, it happens. It happens frequently.
That might come in handy if you're like you need someone to start laughing.
Oh, I can't do it on purpose, that's the funny thing, it's just when I'm genuinely upset, but then
Yeah.
I get a weird Muppet voice, and so then, like, my husband always laughs at me, and I'm just like, "But I'm actually angry, this is."
Like which Muppet? Like Kermit or Cookie Monster?
Yeah, somewhere in between those 2, because my voice is already high, but it gets growly for me, but that's still high.
What's one fashion trend you're glad has come back or you hope never does?
Oh, God, everything right now is back to, like, the '80s and '90s, which has been so weird. I was very not okay for the brief moment that they tried to bring all of the, like, really low-rise jeans back, but I think that, like, passed very quickly in the last 2 years. So we can keep not doing that. That would be great.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree about 80s fashion. It can stay in the 80s.
Yeah, some of it's great. Like, I think it's adorable that bucket hats are back and, like, all the, like, teenagers are wearing them again. Like, I think that's adorable.
Might as well
Um,
bring back top hats.
yeah. Hey, I like any hat. Bring back any hat. I'm happy.
Sarah Lane-Hawn, where can our viewers find out more about what you do and get in touch with you?
Yeah, honestly, the best place to interact kind of informally is via LinkedIn. I'm very active on there, and tend to accept most people if they follow me or send me an invite. I do have a website. It's Lane-Hawn Consulting. Um, it's there. It's official. If people if people want to see that I exist, you know. But LinkedIn is probably the best place to actually have conversations and communication.
LinkedIn, and you have a live show.
I do, yeah. Every day at 12:45 is when we try to go live for 15 minutes. It's super short. And we've been kind of picking a theme each week to go over. And the goal here is to help with prioritization of things that you might be missing, or if you aren't directly in marketing operations, but are in marketing, leadership, or even in the C-suite at a startup, you know kind of what to tap your operations person to do next and be able to say, hey, have we looked into this? When was the
Mhm.
last time we audited our lead score?
Forward the link.
Here's,
Watch
yeah,
this, please. Tell
here's
me
a
what.
quick 15-minute thing. Go
Yeah.
see if we need to do it, right?
Nice.
So trying to just like help with those things that otherwise might go unnoticed and might cause you havoc in the future.
Sarah, thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks. I appreciate it.